The Korean Mafia boss's 9-year-old son refused to leave the hospital until the black nurse revealed what his father really does. The most feared man in Seoul was dying in room 14B of Sungram General Hospital. 3 bullets, 2 surgeons, 1 chance. His son had been sitting in the corridor outside that room for 11 hours straight. He hadn't eaten, he hadn't slept, he hadn't made a single sound. He was just waiting. Spine straight as a ruler, hands folded neatly in his lap. Shoes so perfectly polished they caught the reflection of the fluorescent lights humming above him. 9 years old, dressed in a pressed school blazer with a gold crest on the breast pocket, sitting in a plastic hospital chair the way a general sits at a war table. Like he had called this meeting himself and was simply waiting for the other parties to arrive. That was the first thing Maya Richardson saw when she walked onto the night shift at 2:47 in the morning. And if you think this story is about a mafia boss fighting for his life in a Korean ICU, you are wrong. This story is about his son, about what that boy had been quietly, patiently, meticulously building for 3 years while every adult in his life looked the other way. This story is about the night a Jamaican-American nurse named Maya Richardson walked into a fluorescent-lit corridor and became the final piece of a plan that a 9-year-old had been constructing since he was old enough to pick a lock. Before we go any further, if this story already has you gripped, hit that hype button sitting right below the like button. One tap tells us you want more stories like this. That's all it takes. Now, back to the boy in the blazer. Maya Richardson had worked the night shift at Sungram General Hospital for 4 years. 4 years of 2 a.m. codes, grieving families pacing linoleum corridors, patients who woke up confused and swinging, doctors who barked orders and forgot to say thank you. She had been yelled at in 3 languages. She had held the hands of people taking their last breaths. She had eaten countless granola bars in the supply closet because it was the only place quiet enough to actually taste them. She was not a woman who rattled. She had built herself into someone steady, someone grounded, someone who walked into a crisis and slowed her own heartbeat on purpose. But the boy outside room 14B stopped her before she even reached his chair. It wasn't fear that stopped her. It wasn't even pity. It was something harder to name. The particular unease you feel when something is profoundly wrong with a picture, but you can't immediately identify what. Children in hospital corridors at nearly 3 in the morning were not unusual in Maya's world. Children who sat the way this one sat. That was something she had never seen. There was no slumping, no thumb-sucking, no glazed, exhausted stare of a child who had long passed the point of staying awake by will and crossed into that strange second wind that looks almost like calm. This was actual calm, deliberate calm, the kind of calm that takes practice. She checked the chart in her hands. Room 14B, Kwon Tae-min, 44 years old, male. GSW times 3. Status, critical. She looked at the door. She looked at the boy. She approached slowly the way you approach something unfamiliar that might be more fragile than it looks, or more dangerous. He looked up at her the moment she was close enough for it to be a greeting. Not startled. He had heard her coming long before she arrived. His eyes were dark and sharp, and they moved over her face with a speed that made her feel, briefly, like she was being processed, like information was being sorted behind those eyes with a speed and precision that had no business existing in a child. She asked him his name. He said Ji-hoon. He told her his father was in that room. He said it with 0 tremor, 0 catch in the throat, the way you state a fact about geography. She asked if there was an adult with him, a guardian, someone from the family who was here tonight. He told her there were 6 men at the far end of the corridor. He said she could see them if she looked. None of them were family. She looked. He was right. 6 men in black suits positioned at the corridor's end with the particular stillness of people whose job is to be invisible until they are needed. 2 had earpieces. 1, the largest, with a scar that ran from his jaw to his cheekbone, had the kind of jacket that hung incorrectly on the left side in a way that Maya had seen exactly once before, on a detective who had come to the hospital after a shooting and not thought to leave his weapon in the car. Her stomach pulled tight. She breathed through it. She kept her face professional and easy and kind, and she crouched to Ji-hoon's level, which brought their eyes to the same height. And she told him about the family waiting room downstairs. Much more comfortable, she said. Couches instead of plastic chairs, a television, vending machines, and that she would personally walk down and get him the moment there was any update on his father. He looked at her. He considered her offer with what appeared to be genuine politeness. And then he told her he was not leaving this floor. Not a request refused, not a child digging in. A decision communicated, flat and final, the way adults speak when they have already done the math and the conversation is a formality. She looked at him for a moment longer than the situation required. And then she asked him when he had last eaten. He said lunch, yesterday. She went to the break room. She came back with a ham sandwich in plastic wrap, an orange juice box, and a small bag of honey chips from the vending machine on the second floor, because the one on the fourth floor had been out of them for 2 weeks. She sat down beside him. She told herself it was professional. She needed to assess this child's welfare, determine whether social services needed to be notified, evaluate whether he was safe. That was what she told herself. The truth was simpler and less defensible. She could not leave him alone in that corridor, and she did not entirely understand why. Ji-hoon ate with the same deliberateness with which he did everything. Small, careful bites. He didn't rush, and he didn't dawdle. When he finished, he folded the sandwich wrapper into a neat square and placed it in the small waste bin beside the chairs. He put the empty juice box inside the chip bag, so there was only 1 piece of rubbish instead of 3. Then he set his hands back in his lap, and he turned to look at her with that measuring expression she still hadn't found the right word for. He told her she was going to ask about his father. The directness of it jolted her out of the rhythm she had been settling into. She recovered and said that his father's file listed him as working in private investment. Finance. Ji-hoon said that it always said that. She had already looked him up. The moment she had seen GSW times 3 on a chart with 6 armed men stationed in the corridor outside the room, she had gone to the break room, pulled out her phone, and typed the name into a search engine. Kwon Tae-min. The results had loaded fast. News articles, crime reports, a Wikipedia entry that had been edited and re-edited many times, each version slightly more careful than the last, as if whoever wrote it was aware of who they were writing about. She had read enough. Then she had closed the browser, turned her phone face down on the break room table, and sat very still for 2 full minutes. Because Kwon Tae-min was not a name. He was a presence. He was the man that Seoul's organized crime task force had been trying to indict for a decade and had never managed to touch. The man whose name appeared in police reports as a connection. Always connected, never charged. A ghost in every file. The man linked to 11 disappearances over 7 years, none of which had ever produced a body, a witness, or a case that survived long enough to reach a courtroom. The man who reportedly controlled the movement of half the illicit pharmaceutical trade across 3 provinces, and who owned, through a network of shell companies, an unknown number of legitimate businesses that gave his money a clean face and a paper trail that led nowhere. He was the head of an organization called Cholhyol. It translated to iron blood. It was, by every account Maya could find in the 4 minutes she had spent reading on her phone, the most sophisticated and untouchable criminal network in South Korea. And his 9-year-old son was sitting beside Maya in the ICU corridor, eating honey chips and folding his rubbish into a neat square. She told Ji-hoon she knew his father was a very powerful man. Ji-hoon said she had looked him up. Not a question, a confirmation. She said yes. There was no point lying to him. He nodded, the same slow nod she had seen before, the one that meant she had passed something. Then he said, "And you're still here?" She asked what he meant. He said that most people left when they found out. Not dramatically. They didn't run. They just became very busy. The nurses suddenly needed to be somewhere else. The doctors were always urgently required in another room. Even the police who had come that night, 2 detectives, very correct, very professional, had taken their statement, asked their questions, and left in a way that suggested they were very glad to be doing so. He said it all without judgment, as if he were simply reporting the behavior of a species he had been studying for some time. But she was still here. He said it quietly, and the way he said it told Maya that it meant something to him, that he was working not to show. She asked him, genuinely, why he had been watching her since she came on shift. He said he hadn't been watching everyone. He had been watching her specifically. He had watched the way she handled the family of the patient in the next room, a family that was loud and frightened and needed managing. He had watched the way she de-escalated the man 2 doors down who had become aggressive, who had shouted, and whom she had spoken down from the ledge of his own panic with a patience that cost her something. He had watched the exchange with Suk-do, the scarred man, his father's second, who had come to the corridor 40 minutes into her shift and stepped very close to her and told her, with the quiet menace of someone who did not need to raise their voice, that Mr. Kwan required complete privacy and that the nursing staff should confine their interactions with his room to the absolute minimum. Maya remembered that conversation. She had held her ground, told Suk-do that his employer required a vital signs check every 40 minutes per surgical protocol, and that if Suk-do wished to file a complaint about standard ICU procedure, he was welcome to do so during administrative hours, which began at 8 in the morning. She had then walked past him to do her job. She had not thought anyone was watching. Ji-hoon said she hadn't been afraid of Suk-do. She said, honestly, that she had been a little afraid of him. He considered this and then said, "Yes, but you didn't show it. And you did your job anyway. And then you came back." He said that was what he had been waiting to see. Not bravery, exactly, because bravery without judgment was just recklessness. What he had been waiting to see was whether she was the kind of person who could be afraid of something and still choose to walk toward it when it mattered. Maya was quiet for a moment. Outside the window at the end of the corridor, Seoul was dark and silent. The kind of city silence that isn't really silence at all, just the low, constant exhale of 10 million people sleeping. Ji-hoon said he needed to tell her something. But first he needed to know if she was the kind of person who could hear it without running. The ICU monitors beeped steadily behind the closed door of room 14B. Somewhere distant in the building, a phone rang twice and stopped. Maya looked at this child, this small, composed, ancient child in his pressed blazer with his gold crest and his perfectly polished shoes. And she made a decision of her own. She told him she wasn't going anywhere. What Ji-hoon told her next? He told her the way you describe a documentary you watched. No drama, no performance, no tears, just facts, arranged in the order they had happened, presented with the precision of someone who had been rehearsing this conversation for a long time and wanted to get it right. He told her he had known about his father's real work since he was 7 years old, not because anyone had told him, because he had found the ledgers. His father had a study on the 4th floor of their house. It was always locked. Ji-hoon had learned to open the lock when he was 6, initially because he wanted to read his father's books, which were very good books, the kind of books that nobody else in the house read and that the tutors and the housekeepers weren't allowed to touch. He had been going in to read them for almost a year before the day he found, on the bottom shelf behind a row of economics textbooks, a book that was not a book. It was the right size, the right weight, the right color, but the pages inside were not printed. They were handwritten, columns of numbers, addresses, names, and next to some of the names, not all of them, but some, a single horizontal line drawn through the text in red ink. He had taken photographs of the pages with a small camera he had found in a drawer in the same study. He had printed those photographs using the printer in his bedroom, which no one monitored. He had spent the following weeks looking up every address in the ledger. 3 were warehouses that had appeared in news coverage of police raids, large operations, organized crime task force involvement, significant seizures. 2 were restaurants that had shut down abruptly, without announcement, their social media accounts gone dark overnight. 1 was a building that had burned to the ground 14 months earlier, in a fire that investigators had never officially classified as arson, but that every news article about it treated as an open secret. He had then looked up the names with the red lines through them. He said this part quietly. He said he had found 3 of them in newspaper archives. He did not say what the articles were about. He didn't need to. Maya understood. He said he was not stupid. He said his teachers reported his IQ with great pride at every parent conference, to an empty chair, because his father did not attend parent conferences. He said that a high IQ meant he understood things that children were not supposed to understand, and that nobody had thought to protect him from understanding them, because the people around him assumed his father's world was invisible to him. They had underestimated him, as most people underestimated children. Maya asked him, as steadily as she could manage, whether his father had ever hurt him. Ji-hoon considered this question with a care that suggested he knew it was important and wanted to answer it accurately. Then he said, no. His father loved him, and the way he knew how to love, which was to give him everything he asked for and to keep him inside a very beautiful cage. He said the word cage without irony, without anger, just with the flat recognition of someone who has named a thing correctly and has no energy left to be upset about it. She asked about his mother, and for the first time that night, something moved across Ji-hoon's face that his composure couldn't quite catch in time. It was there for less than a second, a ripple, a hairline crack, and then it was gone, and the surface was smooth again. He said his mother had left when he was 4 years old. She was alive. She lived in Canada. He was not allowed to contact her, and she had not contacted him, which he understood was not her choice. 4 years old. And this child had taken that loss, the loss of his mother, the discovery of what his father was, the years of isolation inside a life of luxury, and compressed it all into a series of clean, manageable sentences and placed it somewhere he could function around it. Except he hadn't. Not really. Because a child who has actually processed grief doesn't sit alone in a hospital corridor for 11 hours without crying. A child who has actually set something down doesn't hold their spine that straight. Ji-hoon was carrying every ounce of it. He was just carrying it in a way that looked, from the outside, like he had put it down. Maya asked him what he was actually asking her. He looked at the door of room 14B for a long time. Then he said, if his father survived, and he believed his father would survive because Kwon Tae-min was a man who had outlasted every threat his world had ever produced, and 3 bullets were not going to be the end of him. Then Suk-doo would take Ji-hoon home. He would return to the house with the 4th-floor study, and the excellent books, and the tutors, and the empty chair at parent conferences. He would continue to grow up inside the beautiful cage. He would be prepared, as he had always been prepared, to inherit what his father was building. Because that was the plan. That had always been the plan. He was not the son of Kwon Tae-min. He was the continuation of Kwon Tae-min. And unless something changed, that was what he would become. He said all of this with the same measured delivery he had used all night. And then he said, but there is a woman named Yu Bora. He said her name like it was the name of a landmark, something fixed and reliable. Yu Bora was a lawyer. She was not a famous lawyer, not a public one, not the kind whose name appeared in newspapers. She was the kind whose name appeared in sealed court documents and classified police briefings. She had been building a case against Kwon Tae-min and the Cheolhyul network for 3 years. Working alone, or nearly alone, funded, Ji-hoon believed, by the families of some of the people who had disappeared. She had an office in Mapogu, Sangam-dong, 3rd floor of a blue building with a white door, and she had been under surveillance by his father's men for long enough that she had to assume any contact attempt through normal channels was compromised. She had everything she needed to build the case, except one thing. She needed a witness from inside. Someone who had been inside the house, inside the study, inside the world. Someone who had seen the ledger. Someone who knew the names. Ji-hoon was that witness. He was 9 years old. He had a photographic memory. He had memorized every page he had photographed. He remembered the addresses, the numbers, the names, and the red lines. He was willing to testify. He had been willing to testify for over a year. The problem was getting the information to Yu Bora without his father's network intercepting it. He couldn't call her. His phone was monitored. He couldn't write to her. The household's mail was screened. He couldn't leave the house without Suk-doo or one of the other men 3 feet behind him at all times. But here, tonight, there was a window. His father was in surgery. Suk-doo's attention was on the door of room 14B, and there was a nurse who had just finished her night shift, who had no connection to the Kwon family, no profile in any of his father's files, no reason to be watched, who could walk out of this hospital at 6 in the morning and drive to Sangam-dong and climb to the 3rd floor of a blue building and knock on a white door. He looked at Maya with those dark, certain eyes, and he said, "That is what I am asking you." The break room was empty when Maya got there. She stood at the sink and ran cold water over her wrists and looked at her own face in the mirror and breathed. She thought about the 6 men in the corridor. She thought about the specific way Suk-doo had looked at her during their earlier exchange. Not angry, not threatening in any explicit way, just aware, taking note. The kind of look that meant she had been filed somewhere. She thought about what happened to people who got in the way of a name like Kwon Tae-min's, and she thought about it with honesty, and without the comfort of telling herself it would probably be fine. Then she thought about a 4-year-old boy watching his mother walk out of a door and being told, in the years that followed, that he was not allowed to reach for her. She thought about a 7-year-old sitting on the floor of a locked study with a book that wasn't a book, working out what the red lines meant, understanding it, and then putting the book back exactly where he had found it, and going back to his room and living inside that knowledge for 2 years before finding a way to act on it. She thought about 11 hours in a plastic chair. She thought about the folded sandwich wrapper in the waste bin. She dried her hands. She pulled out her phone. And then she stopped, because she had just thought of something Ji-hoon had not accounted for. She went back to the corridor fast. She told him the window he was describing was real, but it was smaller than he thought. His father's men didn't just watch Yubora's office. His father's men watched everyone who went near Yubora's office. If she walked in there this morning, a Jamaican-American nurse with no known connection to the case, someone would notice. Someone would ask questions. Someone would trace her back to this hospital, to this shift, to this corridor. And then Ji-hoon would lose his window forever. He looked at her. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that she had not expected. He said, "I know. That's why Yubora has a back entrance. 3rd floor, blue building, white door, that's the front. But if you go around to the alley on the east side of the building, there is a gray door with a broken light above it. That door is never watched, because it doesn't appear in any of the building's registered floor plans. It leads to a staircase. The 3rd floor door on that staircase has a loose upper hinge. You knock 3 times, pause, 2 times. She will answer." Maya stared at him. He said, "I have been planning this for 14 months. And then the door of room 14B swung open. The lead surgeon stepped out with her mask pulled down below her chin and her face carrying that specific, carefully neutral expression that surgeons learn to wear when they are about to deliver news they cannot fully control. Seok-do was moving from the end of the corridor before she had taken 2 steps, covering the distance with a speed that did not match his size. The other 5 men shifted in unison, a subtle collective adjustment, like a single organism responding to stimulus. Ji-hoon stood up, slowly. He straightened the front of his blazer with both hands. The surgeon spoke in Korean. Maya's Korean was functional, not fluent. She caught words and assembled them into meaning. Stable. Critical, but stable. Recovery period. 48 hours minimum before any assessment of lasting damage. His father had survived. Seok-do made a phone call that lasted less than 30 seconds. Whatever he said, it produced visible relief in the men around him. One of them exhaled. Another put a hand briefly on the wall as if steadying himself. They had been waiting too. They had just been better at hiding it. Seok-do ended the call and turned to Ji-hoon. He spoke in Korean, but his tone was the particular tone of adults speaking to children they regard as cargo. Not unkind exactly, but transactional. Ji-hoon was expected. He was to be delivered. The mission of the evening was now transitioning from waiting to returning. Ji-hoon picked up his backpack from between his feet. He adjusted the strap on his right shoulder. He turned to face Maya, and for the space of 1 full second he looked, for the first and only time all night, like the 9-year-old child that he actually was. Uncertain, very slightly afraid, standing at the edge of something he had built but couldn't guarantee. Then Seok-do's hand came down on his shoulder, and Ji-hoon's face closed again, smooth and controlled, and he leaned fractionally toward Maya and spoke in English, low and fast, the words precise and already memorized. Mapo-gu, Sangam-dong, blue building, white door, east alley, gray door, broken light, 3rd floor, loose upper hinge, 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks, before 8 a.m. Tell her Ji-hoon sent you. Tell her he remembers everything. Please, Nurse Maya. Seok-do's hand tightened on the boy's shoulder, and Ji-hoon turned and walked away down the corridor between the men in black suits. He did not look back. Not once. He walked the way he had sat, straight, deliberate, like someone who has decided something and does not revisit decisions. Maya stood alone in the corridor. The door of room 14B was closed again. The fluorescent lights hummed. The monitors beeped. The hospital went on being a hospital, indifferent to everything that had just happened in this stretch of linoleum. She looked at the plastic chair where Ji-hoon had sat for 11 hours. The small waste bin beside it, with the folded sandwich wrapper at the bottom. The absence of him was loud. She had 43 minutes left on her shift. She stood there and she breathed and she thought about all of it. The risk, the weight, the specific face of a 9-year-old boy speaking fast and low, while a dangerous man's hand was on his shoulder, trusting her with something he had carried for 14 months. She thought about what her mother would say. She thought about what the sensible version of Maya, the version that went home and made eggs and didn't get involved in things that weren't her business, would do with this morning. Then she walked to the nurse's station, completed her handover notes, signed out her patients to the incoming shift, drank the last cold inch of a coffee that had been sitting on the counter since midnight, and clocked out at 6:01 a.m. She did not go home. She pulled out of the hospital parking structure into a Seoul morning that was barely beginning. Sky the color of old silver, streets wet from overnight rain, the city not yet awake in any meaningful way. She drove with both hands on the wheel, and the address assembled in her head like a set of coordinates. She did not notice, in her mirror, the black SUV that pulled out of the same parking structure 4 cars behind her. She would not notice it until she was 3 blocks from the blue building in Sangam-dong, when it closed the distance between them by 1 car length in a way that felt deliberate. And here is what Ji-hoon did not know. Here is the thing that none of his 14 months of planning had accounted for. The man in the black SUV was not one of Sok-do's people. He was not someone connected to Kwon Tae-min's network at all. He was something far more complicated. A man who had been watching Yu-bora's building for 3 weeks, who had intercepted enough of Yu-bora's communications to know a move was coming, who had his own reasons for wanting the Chol-hil case to disappear that had nothing to do with loyalty to Iron Blood and everything to do with what that case would uncover about people far above Kwon Tae-min in a chain that the public didn't know existed. Ji-hoon had spent 3 years planning his escape from the most dangerous man in Seoul. He had not planned for the men above him. He had not planned for the possibility that someone had been waiting just as patiently, just as quietly, just as long. Not to stop his father, but to stop the case. To stop Yu-bora. To stop anyone who came through that gray door in the East Alley before the truth inside it reached a courtroom. Maya Richardson was 3 blocks from a blue building with a white door, and she was driving straight towards something that was much larger and much older than one boy's plan to be free. The question of what she found on that 3rd floor, what Yu-bora told her, what was in the case file that people with real power needed to bury, what Ji-hoon had actually memorized in that 4th floor study, because the ledger was only part of it, and the part he had not yet told Maya was the part that explained why his mother had really left, and why she had not been allowed to come back, and what she knew that made her a liability who was safer in Canada than in Seoul. All of that is part 2. And part 2 begins the moment Maya decides whether to keep driving or to turn the car around. If you want to find out what she chose, hit the hype button right now, the one sitting directly below the like button, and drop part 2 in the comments. When enough of you ask for it, Ji-hoon's story continues. And I promise you, what comes next will hit harder than anything in this part.